Welcome into the Bible from CR11. I'm glad that you have joined me here today, and I certainly hope that this video finds you doing well. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, I would encourage you to do that now. And if you like the content of this video, certainly hit that like button and share it. Today we're going to seek to answer a question that was sent to me. And in light of that, I want to remind you that if you have a question, a subject, a topic, something you would like me to see cover in an upcoming video, you can put it in the comment section below, or you can email me at bgwcr11@gmail.com. Now, with that said, the question that was sent to me has to deal with tithing. The question was basically this: is tithing for us? And by for us, the question implied for the church today. And I think this is a very good question because it answers a lot of assumptions. It answers a lot of traditions. So the way that I would answer this question is I would cut the Bible up into three pieces, because this is how the Bible presents itself in this situation. We have what is known as the pre-Mosaic law, or the pre-Mosaic time. We have the Mosaic time, and then we have the post-Mosaic time. And what that means simply is this: there was a time before the law was given to Moses, where Moses and the children of Israel entered into what's known as the Mosaic covenant. And then there's a time after the Mosaic covenant. So before the Mosaic covenant, you had the likes of Abraham, you had the likes of Noah, right? You had the likes of a Methuselah and Adam. All of them lived before the Mosaic covenant. In fact, the book of Galatians says that Abraham lived more than 4 centuries before the Mosaic covenant and the law was given. And we certainly live after it, right? Because Christ fulfilled the law and the prophets, according to Matthew 5:17, according to Christ. So with all of that said, we need to cut this question into 3 pieces. What were we commanded to do before the Mosaic law? What were they commanded to do during the Mosaic law? And what is the command after the Mosaic law? Now, tithing simply means tenth, right? It means 10%. Do I personally think that that's a good measuring stick? Certainly, but that's up to the individual. For some people, it may be 3%. For some people, it may be 30%. And I hope to bring context to that statement here in just a moment. But a lot of times believers today carry over the tithe into the church, into the New Testament, as though it was God's command for us, as though it is biblical law. The New Testament does not address any of that. In fact, the New Testament tells us today that believers are to give a very specific way. And that very specific way is laid out in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And that's how we are to base our giving. Now, before I get to that, let me address very specifically the tithe. Before the Mosaic law, there was no such thing as tithing. After the Mosaic law, except in the traditions of men and language, there is no such thing as the tithe either. You're not going to find that beyond the Gospels, and you'll find it in the Gospels only as it relates to the new covenant being established and what was going on there in those times. But post death, burial, resurrection, the coming of the Spirit of God in Acts 2, the birth of the church, tithing is never found there. It wasn't a command. You see, before the Mosaic law and after the Mosaic law, tithing is not the rule of thumb from God to us. But there's some people who beat this drum and are really going to die on this hill. And so the question that needs to be raised, if you believe that that is God's command for you, I would ask you this question: which tithe are you talking about? Because under the Mosaic law, where the tithe is, There wasn't one. There wasn't even two. There was three. You see, the tithe, and to break this down, there were three tithes that the Jewish people had to pay every year. There was a tithe to the priest, to the Levitical priest, those who descended from the tribe of Levi. Then there was a tithe that was given every year to support the feast, the festivals, and all that God had commanded them to do. And then every third year, there was a poor tithe that was recognized every third year. So on average, to live under the Mosaic covenant, there wasn't a tithe, there was three, and it broke down to 23.33% on average every year. Or you could say for 2 years you paid two tithes and you paid 20%, and the third year you paid 30%. So which of those tithes that God established under the Mosaic law are we held to? Furthermore, there was also the temple tax. You remember Peter was questioned about the temple tax, and then Jesus commands Peter to go catch a fish, and you'll find the coins that's needed in there. So there was a temple tax that had to be paid every year. So not only were there the three tithes, not only was there a temple tax, but there was also things for farmers, for instance. We find this in the book of Ruth when we find Boaz. If you were a farmer, any grain that fell off of your wagon, anything that was left behind, you couldn't go pick up and touch. The poor would follow behind you, and that's how they would eat. You couldn't harvest the corners of your field, or if you are driving a wagon and a bale of some crop fell off, you can't stop and pick it up. It's for the poor. So in all fairness, they probably on average paid about 30% a year. Now, that did not exist before the Mosaic covenant. The only time you find that is one time when Abraham paid a one-time tribute to Melchizedek, and he gave him a tenth of what he had at that moment in time. So is the tithe commanded for the New Testament church? No, that's not found in Scripture. And Paul warns us in 1 Corinthians 4, verses 6, not to go beyond what is written. So how is the New Testament believer to give? That's the question. Because we should give. And how are we to give? Well, there's two passages of Scripture that I would point your attention to. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 through 3. And what we find there is that believers were to be consistent in their giving, and they were to be systematic in how they gave. So depending on your job, depending on what you did, whatever you gave, you should give consistently. That way the church would know, per se, what they could expect or what should be expected, so they can make necessary plans. That's the way that we generally do it, not only in church, but in life. You have an idea of what's coming in, so you know what can go out. But they were to give consistently. They were to give on a regular basis. How much were they to give? That's between them and God. That's where the second passage comes in. In 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 6 and 7, the Bible tells us to give cheerfully, not under compulsion, but willingly. And so the New Testament church is to give cheerfully, they are to give willfully, and they are to give consistently. Now, what is the magic number? Well, the truth of the matter is there isn't one. There wasn't one before the Mosaic covenant of 30%. There's not one after the Mosaic covenant. If 10% is where your conviction lies at, then give 10%. If 5%, if 20%, whatever it is, I would refer you back to Romans 14:5. Let each be convinced in their own mind. Because here's the reality of this. I remember hearing a story of a Texas pastor one day, and there was an old man that was in his church that was making somewhere around $20 million a year at the time, and this story is probably 30 years old. So that money would be much more today. And he was complaining to the pastor. He says, I don't know why these people don't give their 10%. And the pastor wisely looked at him and he told him, he said, you make $20 million a year. It's nothing for you to give $2 million. It's just a tax write-off to you. But what about that single mother who's making $30,000 a year? That $3,000 is a lot of money. And you're going to hold her to a standard that God is not holding her to. If you really want to feel her pressure, instead of you giving your 10%, your $2 million and keeping 18, give your 18 and you keep 2. And the way the story goes, the conversation abruptly ended. He didn't want to hear that. The point is, when it comes to giving, it should be from your heart, it should be consistent, and it should be willingly. Whatever that amount is, that's between you and God. There is nothing in the New Testament that beholds us to paying one tithe after another as they had to under the Mosaic covenant. And those tithes, once again, were to the priest, were to the festivals, to the funding of those festivals, their feast, and then to the poor. And also the temple tax, also the food that I spoke of about the corners of the field or something left behind. That system of the way they done things was established by God, and it was established for a reason. We don't live under that covenant. We don't live under that system. We live under the new covenant. And when God speaks to giving, he speaks to it in 1 Corinthians 16, 1-3, and he speaks to it in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 6-7. So I certainly hope that this helped to answer that question. So until next time, I'll talk to you later, neighbor.